Hey everybody, welcome to Inside.net. My name is Celso Philip. I'll be your host today. And I'm especially excited because I have my friend here, Michael, who I have not seen in such a long time. And he's here. He's going to talk to us about how we can migrate our Xamarin apps from Xamarin to MAUI. And so for folks that aren't familiar, MAUI stands for Multi-Platform User Interface Framework thing. I think that's what it means. But essentially, it's like the new version of Xamarin Forms, right? And so if you've already invested a lot of time and effort and technical debt inside of building your apps using Xamarin, now you might want to know, okay, well, what do I have to do to go forward to this brand new world, right? Like, how do I move to MAUI? What's different? What are some of the things that I need to think about? And so that's essentially what our conversation is going to be about today. As always, feel free to go ahead and drop your questions inside the chat, inside of the comment section. And as we get a chance, we'll make sure we bring them up and we'll make sure we ask them to Michael. But before we go ahead and kind of dive into it, Michael, why don't you do a quick introduction to yourself? Let folks know who you are and what do you do?
For sure. Yeah, no problem. My name is Mike Stonis. I'm a partner over at a company named 8bot, and I do mobile. That's basically what we do day in and day out. So been working with forms for what feels like a forever, I guess. It's been, I think, since like 2011, and just been working on transitioning stuff to MAUI and kind of getting up to speed on all those good things.
I remember the first few times that you and I met, and we've done videos before in the past. The conversation was always around like reactive, right? Reactive extensions, reactive UI,
right?
And usually in the context of a Xamarin application, right? Like, how can I, create like these reactive interfaces, using the extensions and stuff like that. So I know you have a lot of experience doing mobile stuff because I feel like that was, I don't know, like 5-6 years ago.
Sure, yeah.
Since we've been talking about this stuff. Yep. So for someone like me, right? Like, so I don't necessarily have Xamarin apps in the store, but I know how Xamarin works. I'm familiar with Xamarin iOS, Xamarin Android, Xamarin Forms. You know what I mean? Like, I understand like how that world works. But then MAUI sounds like it's the new exciting thing that .NET developers should be looking at, should be targeting. So I guess for me, I kind of want to start off with like one of the things that I've always heard about MAUI that's particularly confusing for me, and maybe you can help me with this, is that MAUI has been presented to me as like the evolution or the next version of Xamarin Forms, right?
Right.
Is that so? Now, what if I'm building an app that's based on like Xamarin Android or Xamarin iOS? Like,
sure,
what happens to that? Like, where do those apps fit into like this new vision of what the future looks like?
Sure. So there's a couple of ways I could answer this, I guess. So it's a great question to have. So in the past, so if we go all the way back to, kind of where we started out there, and actually, I've got like a slide. I'm just going to pull it up here and kind of use this as reference. This is a good question to start off with. So if we go all the way back to like where Xamarin came from, right? So if we think of like where we originally started with Xamarin, before Forms, I guess, what we would call Xamarin native a lot of times. We kind of had Xamarin Android and Xamarin iOS out there. And a lot of people built their applications on it. And you could kind of think of it as being, it's sort of like if you were to just if you were to just take the SDKs for iOS and the SDKs for Android, wrap them up and just make them available for C#. That's what you got with those. Okay. Now, going forward into the future, we still have that. So it really hasn't gone away. Those are still available. But the difference being now is we've got .NET 6 and we'll have .NET 7 coming forward in the future, where instead of those being kind of like their own thing, which I'll try to explain a little bit more in I think a few minutes, but like instead of those being kind of like, oh no, that's sort of .NET for iOS and that's .NET for Android. What we've got now with .NET 6 is we've got .NET 6 and also iOS, and .NET 6 and also Android. And then how MAUI plays into that is once we had kind of gone forward a little bit in the future for like from the Xamarin native side is, we realized, hey, we're building applications across multiple platforms. And that's where Forms kind of came into play is let's not build or rebuild the UI on each platform. Let's give us kind of like an API to work with that knows how to communicate with those platforms and build those native UIs. And that's what Forms did, just kind of gave us like either XAML UI or C# UI to work with. And say this is a button, and then it will go build a UI button on Android, or UI button on iOS, and a widget button over on Android. MAUI is just sort of the next evolution of that. So instead of being those like siloed off, again, like, hey, it's we've got sort of the Xamarin native stuff and everything like that. Now it's just .NET 6. And now it's because we've kind of have that like flattening that's happened with .NET 6, we can take it a little bit of a step further. It's sort of like a consolidation, I guess, if you will, where it's instead of being siloed off everywhere, everything's in .NET 6 now. So everything's under, it's sort of like all in the same control zone. I don't know.
Sure.
I need to think of a better way to explain this. Sorry.
It's like in the same bundle of stuff, right? Like it's in the same package. So
correct. Yeah. So instead of, right, because now when you get .NET 6, it's sort of like, oh, I want .NET 6 and that's my starting point. And then, oh, also I would like to add the features for iOS or add the features for Android. So as opposed to being like a totally separate thing as it was before, if that makes sense. So if you want to have those, so I guess long story short, if you have those old applications, you can still migrate them over. You could still do everything you were doing out there in the past. Just instead of being a Xamarin native application, it would just be a .NET 6 iOS application or a .NET 6 Android application.
Got it. So then if I was in that space, or if I am in that space today, it's not that I won't be able to build those things, but is it fair to say like those won't be MAUI applications? Those would be, like you said, .NET iOS applications, .NET Android applications, .NET UWP applications.
Correct.
Right? But I'll just be targeting like those direct SDKs.
You got it.
Using the layer of MAUI, which again gives us some level of abstraction over like the details of how some of those things work, right?
You got it. Yeah. So, right. And if you know that you're targeting just one platform and you're just ever going to that one platform, there could be some benefits of developing just for that, right? So you might have, some SDKs that you want to make use of, or maybe some particular like development styles that you want to make use of for that platform that might not be available in a cross-platform manner, right? And so if you know that you're targeting or you're building something like hyper specific for that platform, that might be a good idea. But for all the other use cases, like if you know that you're going to want to have Android and iOS and Windows and things like that, why not use MAUI, right? It's already got everything you need, and it can be extended. So that's the other thing. So even if you really want to do something that's like pretty like platform specific, it's not going to prevent us entirely from doing that either.
Okay, great. Another thing that I think about now is, so we're gonna move forward. So we have the iOS stuff, we have the Android stuff. So now again, when I think about MAUI, right, when I think about Xamarin in general, right, it was always hey, I want you to make it easier for me to build these apps that are run across these different spaces. Right. And so I'm thinking, oh, I can build something that runs on tablets and phones, right? I can build something that targets watchOS if I wanted to, or Android Wear, or whatever those things are called today. But now like the code base is unified, right? And I could share, a little bit more code sharing. I think it was like 80% or more at the time when we were talking about it. But then now I just get more reusability over the types of apps I'm trying to build. But now that I've focused all my time and effort on that, I have my custom controls that I've written or purchased. I have my custom libraries that I've pulled into my Xamarin application, or maybe even, I think they're called like either Cocoa Pods or Java jars that I've pulled into my application for those platform-specific functionalities. And now there's this MAUI thing, right? Which looks cool and it's fun and it's exciting, and everyone gets excited about the new cool things. But now as a developer, I'm like, oh my God, you just gave me more work to do. Because I got to target another thing, right? So, and I know we're going to talk about, what the APIs look like and those types of things, but I want us to have a conversation about like the decision to migrate, right?
Sure.
So like, when do you think is a good time for folks to migrate to MAUI, assuming that I already have like a legacy of, investments already in a Xamarin Forms application?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So, where we're at right now, MAUI has been GA'd, so it is out there live. So there is no, if you've got an existing Forms application, you could already start investigating switching over to MAUI, right? So there's nothing to stop you, at least, primarily at this time. Your migrate, like depending on what you have in your application, your migration is going to be, it may differ. So, and I think you brought up some pretty common scenarios for what people have. Cause like, if you think of like most Forms applications, you're going to have sort of what comes out of the box. So that would be like the controls that come out of the box and things like that. You're going to have some third-party NuGet packages, almost invariably. Some of those might be like, we'll say like parsing things. You might have Newtonsoft JSON, or you might have like a library like that. That's kind of not UI specific. And so that should be pretty well portable. Like there's really no concern with bringing that over. But then you start to get into some other libraries, which are more like platform specific. So you might have like a third-party UI library that you've brought in that adds like controls that were built for Forms off the native platforms. Or you might have a library that does some like interaction with the operating system in a specific way. So it might be for like push notifications. It could be for, something like that. I don't know. Those libraries will need to get, so like those libraries that were targeting Xamarin in the past are going to need to be migrated over to MAUI. So those won't just work exactly right out of the box. There were changes to namespaces. There's changes to things like that. So what I would say is, there's no reason, and we're going to walk through like what the migration process looks like. It's not as like, it's not terribly daunting. I'll put it that way. It's actually like a quick thing that you could do. But if you've got an existing Forms application, what I would say is give it a shot to do the migration and then see what's maybe doesn't migrate over. Again, depending on what you're using, it might just go right over and you're totally set to go in an afternoon. If you do have other third-party, controls, see if they've upgraded them to MAUI or if they've migrated them to MAUI on their side. And then if not, you may have to investigate and see what it might take to do some migration for some of the other libraries. Like if you're using an open source library that's doing something for, I don't know, like notifications or doing something that interacts with the local hardware that was written for Forms, you may want to pull that down and then, migrate that library or something like that, or talk to the maintainer and see if they're looking to continue with it. But so I guess, again, kind of to answer it, I think you should be investigating it. We've got it, support for Forms, as I've got kind of on the slide here too. Support for Forms is going to go through about mid 2024. So, it's something that I always would advocate, especially if it's something that runs your business. Like you should probably be looking at this early and often to see like, can I migrate today? If you can, you should probably move down that path. But if there are hurdles, you should identify those as soon as possible, just so you can take care of those and continue on.
So I think that's also good to know, right? That we have until May 2024. So we have a little bit over a year, right? To kind of figure it out, right? And then to get this thing started out and kind of get going. But like you said, it does give you the opportunity to experiment a little bit, try some things out, target whatever your core scenarios are, like target what your core concerns are, and try and see, okay, well, what's going to be the path for us to go from where we are today to like where we want to go tomorrow, assuming that we want to migrate over to using something like that.
Right.
Now, that being said, like we did have a comment coming from YouTube from Edgar Gonzalez, and he's like, binding native libraries are really hard to make right. Depends on the binding. It can take weeks. And the process has not been proven in years. Do you have any comments about that? I haven't tried to bind any native libraries or, again, like CocoaPods or jars or anything like that. But like, how's that been for you?
I've done a lot of that. So yeah, and he's not wrong. Yeah, binding native libraries has always been tough. I know this is something that the team's looking at more in depth for .NET 7. I don't have an answer for exactly how that's going to look. I know that there's been a lot of ideas. Some of the stuff like, so bindings as it is today for MAUI is pretty much how it was for Xamarin in the past. You're going to kind of build a wrapper around those native method calls and everything like that you're doing. I know that, again, like there's some thought about like, how can we make that simpler? So if we think about how, for example, like how Flutter does their kind of like bindings, they've got like a real thin shim that they use. So you don't, like if I think of how a traditional Xamarin binding works, it's kind of like a everything everywhere type of binding, if that makes sense. So if we could just break it down to an individual binding, that's probably, like just the pieces that you need type of binding, that would be great. But again, I don't know exactly where that's going, exactly how that's going to play out, but I do know for sure that the MAUI team's aware of it and they're trying to do something, they're trying to do their best to make that a little bit nicer going forward here.
I guess it's kind of like what you said, right? It depends on like what that particular library is doing. Like, are we talking about a library that's, again, like JSON.NET, or like some functional type library that's, I don't know, maybe I'm parsing files or doing something of the sort? Or is it something that's more on the operating system level that, I'm accessing particular directories, or, the sensors on the device, like the GPS or whatever the case is? Like those now I'd assume would be a little bit more challenging, maybe.
Sure.
More specific to the actual platform, rather than just me running some pre-canned business logic to do something.
Yeah. And if you think of like, something like if you wanted to bind the Google libraries for doing Firebase communications or something like that, those would be, they're big. They're massive, right? But if you're doing something like maybe it's a custom control for doing like a floating button or something like that, the surface level that you maybe need isn't that big, so it totally varies depending on what you're interacting with there.
Gotcha. Hey, Rodney, what's going on, man? Good to see you.
Time zones are hard. I thought I scheduled this for 4 p.m. UTC. It's 3 p.m. UTC, and I'm wondering, did I miss a time change? So I apologize.
It's all good, brother. It's all good. It's all good. Well, we missed you, so I'm glad you're here.
I'm glad to be here. So one of my favorite people in the community that we get to talk to today. So
I was sure that you were just angry with me and didn't want to go out there. Like,
I don't think I can be.
He's like, I'm out of here. I'm not dealing with Mike anymore. It's good to see you, bud.
Good to see you too.
So we talked a little bit about, again, Xamarin iOS, Xamarin Android, and now we're talking about Xamarin Forms going into .NET MAUI. So when I think about an application, obviously we're talking about mobile applications, but when I think about an application in general, and I'm moving from version this to version that, there's a couple of things that go into my head, right? I think about how the APIs are going to change. Right. I think about like, how is my tooling going to be any different? And I also think about stuff like, well, what does my deployment process look like? Like, how does that change as well? So I think those are three, and I'm sure there's more to it too, but I think those are the three major topics I'd love for us to talk about, right?
Sure.
I know if folks have been following like the community stand-ups and these types of things, we've seen tons of demos of MAUI apps.
Sure.
One of the things that stands out to me the most is like the structure is completely different, because now there's this single project. Project? Yes. Single project template.
It's not a single,
It's all smoke and mirrors.
It is? You think so?
It is. Because all the stuff still exists behind the scenes where it's supposed to on the native platform, but it's just brought into one single project. So when we first started down this road of .NET, of .NET, right? Not the .NET framework, but the new .NET, DNU, DNX. When we first started down this path, everyone was doing these bait and switch NuGet packages to target multiple places, right? So that's really all we're doing is we have some CS proj magic that baits and switches the right files to the right place based upon the platform that you're targeting. And if you remember back then, you could either bring everything into one package and do platform specific folders and or files, or you could do platform specific NuGets with different CS projects. So basically what we've done is kind of piggyback onto that and make it more of a formal thing. But you can also do the old school way, which is the multiple projects. I know I'm stealing your thunder, Mike, so I'll shut up.
No, you're right.
I had a lot of experience in that space. Like I broke a lot of packages back then.
We've all been there for sure. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So then what you're saying is that, so before we had different projects because again, there was some MS builds magic happening that would like change based on the target, right? Like probably some if defs and some other stuff that we probably didn't see that was happening. But now you're saying instead of it being multiple projects, it's a single project, right? But it's the same thing, just in a different structure, right? And so
there's multiple. So this is where like the how far do we want to go into how the sausage gets made in some of the older applications? Because I could show some examples, but like what we primarily dealt with in the past would be, so this is really quick. This is the eShops application. It's sort of Microsoft's like, hey, it's a good example of like an enterprise application, and it's got all the different service layers and everything like that kind of show how you can build out an app. And I guess the first thing to show here, and this is the Xamarin Forms version of it, is in the past, we were always targeting something like Net Standard. So we would have likely Net Standard 2, maybe Net Standard 2.1 if it was a newer application, something like that. But the thing is here with Net Standard is it has no knowledge of other platforms. So like it has to work in a platform agnostic manner, right? So if I were to come in here and try to do something for iOS without doing some of the magic stuff that Rodney was alluding to there, it would likely yell at me, right? So what I end up having to do is just write generic code here. And then you would end up with these separate projects where you would have to, build out, add your Android code, add your iOS code, and then shim data back to your core project. So you might, for example, you might define like an interface in the core project. And then when it comes down to the actual implementation of it, you might implement that interface on the platform project. So just as a quick example here, we've got some interface called iTheme for setting a status bar color. And then out here on iOS, I can make use of things like Foundation and UI Kit and do any of the other work that I needed to do out here for iOS. I guess I'll jump forward just a little bit just to kind of show this here. And I won't have a perfect example, but instead of having all those different projects, kind of like we've been talking about here, instead of having all those different projects in your solution, now what we could do is we could just have this platforms folder. And then inside that platforms folder, we can access and make use of those different platforms code, right? So if I need to do something for UI Kit, I could put it in this iOS folder here and I can access UI Kit, no problem. If I need to do something for Android, likewise, I can come out here to the Android folder and I could do anything that I need to out here. And at the end of the day, like it is a little bit of some CS Proj magic that's making all this happen. But like from a cognitive load and burden, I don't have to context switch between going through all these different projects. I can kind of just provide my implementation right here in the same project and then have it be brought out for my actual app.
So
Gotcha.
fair being fair, it's still the same technical process of having to implement an interface and then have a platform specific implementation. The difference is now I don't have the cognitive load of switching between CS projects and finding it. It's all in one folder, one place.
Correct. Yeah. So you still, absolutely right. So you would still have some of that work to do. And I guess I could probably even show like another, I don't want to jumping around, like too much, but like, it's just good examples here because again, like you could even do something, and this is where it can get a little bit trickier here, depending on how you want to write this. I don't know that this is what I would recommend as a good best practice, but it's just what I'm doing to get some sample code kind of up and running on my side.
Sure.
Is you could even have like, at this point in time, because it's all under one project, you could even do things like this where you would end up with just one file, but you could use compiler directives to say, if this is running on the iOS platform, bring in these namespaces and do things like this. Like, hey, if I know I'm going to have to build this graphics view, build the very specific iOS one, and then grab a tap gesture from iOS. So you could do some code intermingling, which again, I don't love exactly, but you could do it this way or use the interface way as well. But likewise, again, you don't have to think about like, oh, I've got to switch over to the iOS project now. Oh, I've got to switch over to the Android project now. It's just go to that folder and make sure you've got it available out there.
Gotcha. And then for folks that don't know, right? So like what you're doing there on line 33 is that you're just using those compiler directives. And I'm guessing like iOS, Android, UWP, blah, 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 blah. Like those are all defined somewhere, right? So like based on the platform you want to target, you say, if it's this thing, do this. Otherwise, like do something else, right? And
correct. Yeah.
That'll get compiled in or away based on whatever the target just happens to be at the time.
Right. So yeah, with like a MAUI application, we're going to have a couple of these directives built in here for the platforms that we support. And then likewise, if you need to do something that's very specific for that, for a platform, you could also just sort of throw that code into these platform folders here, and then it knows to only pull that code in on that platform. So you've got a couple different ways to tackle it there.
Okay. So one question I've had ever since I first saw like this platform folder situation is anytime I've tried to create a MAUI application, and so I'm on a MacBook just for context, it adds all of these targets, right? And I think pre-RTM or pre-release, whatever you want to call it, on my Mac, it would create like a Windows thing, like a Windows UWP thing.
UI.
And then I try and run it, and it yell at me and be like, "You don't have this thing." And I'm like, "Duh, I don't obviously don't have it. I'm on a Mac, right?" And so then it kind of got me thinking, can I dynamically turn on and turn off platforms? Like, what if I'm building a thing and I only want it to target Android and I don't really care about the other stuff? Can I file new projects MAUI only for Android, or is it a thing that like I have to create it and like, I don't know, delete and undelete if I want to like add, remove these different platforms that I'm targeting?
Great question. Yeah. Today's experience is basically you would create the MAUI project, and then afterwards you could come into the CS project. So I'm just going to come in here. And again, this is the migrated to MAUI version of the eShop project.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to edit the project file. And then what you could see in here, these are all my target frameworks. So I've got, .NET 6 all the way at the end, Mac Catalyst, iOS, Android. And then you could see I've got this conditional one here where it's saying like, hey, if you're on Windows, and you've got the MS Build runtime set to full, let's toss in the Windows framework as well. So if you don't want it, like, if you didn't want to do Windows, or if you knew that Mac Catalyst wasn't part of your requirements, you could just come in here and remove it. And that's no longer going to be part of the compilation. So you can remove it here. And then if you really wanted to as well, you could clean up that platform folder out there if you just want to get that totally gone.
Okay. But there's no experience today that removes both, right? That's going to remove both the folder and the MS Build property, right? Like,
I don't, in terms of today, I think if you do a MAUI project, you just get everything that's supported with it.
Okay.
You can take a look. I've got like the latest out here, and yeah, you kind of get what you get out there.
Sure.
But it could be something where in the future you can maybe choose like it's a MAUI.NET 7 app, but maybe you choose X, Y, and Z underneath it.
Okay.
They used to have that for forms, so I would assume it's coming, right?
It's coming at some point.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I asked is for a source control perspective, right? I don't want to maintain code that I don't want, right? And so I'm probably gonna want to delete it. But maybe at some point, I don't know, version 3, 4, 5, we decide, oh well, I got a big app now. My app is used by tons of Android people. I want to add iOS folks, and I want to add a desktop thing. But maybe I only want to do that later on. I don't want to keep lugging around this code with me, maybe for later.
Sure.
I prefer to just not have it and not think about it and then add it later. But like you said, like if it's coming later, I think that's one thing. Again, like when I first saw it, that's the first thing that popped into my head. I'm like, there's a lot of folders in here. Like, how can I?
For sure.
Because I like to delete stuff. Like every time I get file new project for anything, whatever it's on, ASP.NET, whatever, I'm like, okay,
trim it down.
Don't need this, don't need this. Bye, delete, and I'm good, right? So that's the first thing I'm thinking about. Like, how do I trim off the stuff I don't need, and then later on have the ability to add it when I bleed it a little bit later.
So yeah, I think, depending on, how you're coming at it, like if that you're just doing Android, you could trim off the iOS and Mac Catalyst bits or the Windows bits or whatever you need there. And then to add them back in later, you just have to make sure that you follow the pattern, right? So if you get rid of iOS, just make sure you fill it back in with sort of the pattern folder and the files you would need out there for that platform.
Got it. Now, I know another thing that was different. Again, we're talking about like what the code looks like to migrate it over. I know another thing that I saw that was different is that the startup is also different, right? Like the startup looks very similar to that ASP.NET Core builder pattern situation where, there's DI and there's configuration and there's logging and there's stuff.
You got it.
Inside of there, right? And which I think is cool, right? Because I think on some level you get a level of reusability. But I'm also wondering, like, how well, in your experience, did those things pair? Because again, like a lot of that was built from a web world perspective. How well does that pair with what folks are doing in the mobile space?
We've needed this. I don't know if Rodney feels different at all about this, but we've needed something like this in the mobile side for forever. Because we've never had it. And so what you end up with, like in a forms application today, is you have kind of two primary entry points. You have the native entry point, which would be like if we're on iOS, for example, it's likely going to be your app delegate, where out here you might do some initialization for components and interfaces that need to integrate with the platform itself. Say you have an interface that implements I'm just gonna say like notifications or local notifications or something like that. You might come in here and you might register a bunch of interfaces with dependency injection or a service locator here. Then in addition to that, you might come out to your probably like your app.xaml.cs or your app.cs. And in your constructor out here, you might do the same thing, but you might do it for more shared components. You might be doing it for like repositories or services that are environment dependent, but maybe not platform dependent in that case.
Got it. Okay.
And it was just a mishmash. Every project I've ever worked on and every team did it a little bit different. So if you had an MVVM framework that maybe gave you some guidance on how to do it, you were doing it one way. If you had a team that was using service locators for providing dependencies, they would do it one way. If you had dependency injection, it was a different way. And so now, like at least with MAUI, there's still going to be a little bit of some platform hurdles that you might hit out there, but we do have our MAUI app, which is going to give us kind of this nice, consistent place to go do the registration. So along with that, like the probably one of the big new features that we have with MAUI is a DI container that comes with it. So we didn't have, we kind of had like a dependency service in the past. It was a service locator. It's okay. It's still there. You can still use it, but like we have real dependency injection that comes with MAUI nowadays. So if you want to do, and especially I think this will be like, it's helpful to standardize this in a lot of ways. Cause like, again, if you've got a lot of web developers coming to MAUI, you got people that are familiar with doing like, back-end type development. I get it asked all the time, like, where do I go and register DI and stuff like that? And today, and it's like, well, my team uses service locators. So you go and use this thing called Splat and you throw them all there and then you give it a thumbs up and call it a day.
Right.
But that's not what they're familiar with. So here, at least they could come in and you've got that same kind of idea. You've got your service collection that you're working with, and then you just provide all your, your interfaces and then their actual implementation. So this is something that like, in terms of one of the big new features that we have with MAUI, having this consistent, dependable way to register services for multiple different reasons, not even just as as a developer implementing a project, but also like when we're doing libraries that are going to be shared throughout. I know that I can work with this and I can register whatever I'm building. If it's custom UI components or some kind of platform service, I know I could basically just bring it out here. And this is the de facto place to register those components and have them used going forward. So it's something that was like I said, sorely needed in my opinion, kind of for forums and and now, for mobile development and for a long time there.
So I have a question for you, Mike, and this may be, well, it's definitely the right forum to ask, but probably, a faux pas question to ask. So I've been playing with MAUI recently. As you know, I help maintain reactive UI, and I've been trying to figure out how to get this, specifically get the dependency injection working with MAUI, but then there's a navigation component that's added into it because it doesn't really support MVVM out the box. So even though I can go and register all of my services today, just out of the box MAUI, there's no way for me to actually resolve those dependencies in a consistent and clean manner. So you need a Prism or a reactive UI or MVVM cross. Like you need something else that allows you to tie into it, because even though you can register those dependencies, and this is just what I've experienced, somebody may have a different and can tell me later, hey, find me on the internet and tell me how to do it. Obviously I suck, right? There's no consistent way to get that stuff out of the container. So yes, we got a great way to register stuff, but you still haven't given us a way to actually use it. So I'm finding, like, I was looking through the Prism implementation. I've been looking through my own implementation. The registration is the simple part.
Yep.
The hard part is, how do I navigate to a page, resolve the dependencies for the view model, attach the view model to the view, and get all of the lifecycle notifications to be able to bootstrap my view model together. That's the part that seems to be missing out of the box. And until we have that, I mean, you're going to be pretty much dependent on a third-party framework. So from what I see,
that's where I'd say you're right, and it depends. I'm a consultant. Everything's always going to be.
Stop it. I'm right, Mike. You don't have to worry about it.
It's situational though. So if you follow, depending on how you're building your Xamarin application, a lot of Xamarin applications are built using navigation pages, content pages, where sort of the root of your application is it almost invariably is like the very root of your application is a navigation page.
Mm-hmm.
You add a page to that navigation page, and then you push pages along the way to go do the work.
Right.
In MAUI, and so if you're doing that way, at least again, I could be wrong on this too, but my understanding is the same, that if you're doing exactly that right out of the box, for like you say, navigate from page A to page B, doing that type of navigation, you would still have to go and reach out to the dependency injection container and resolve those dependencies yourself.
Right.
If, however, though, you use shell and its shell navigation, all of that works right out of the box for you. There's no additional need to do anything. So if you, for example, like if I come to my app here, like I'm F12 to this one, you can see I've got like my app out here. So I've got use MAUI app, and I just tell it, here's my app. I don't give it a constructor. I don't give anything else. But if I go to the definition for it, you'll see that as part of its constructor, it takes in all those interfaces.
Mm-hmm.
And so it'll bring all those in from there. The root of my application then is this shell app. And so if I do something, just try to see here. I'm just going to go to like, see if I could find a view. That would be a good one for probably here. So somewhere in here, I'm going to my basket view. I don't know. I've got I'll just go to the shell. I've probably got this registered.
Yep. Cool.
Out here. You can see I've got some of my routes registered out here. Here's my catalog and my profile route that I've got registered with shell. Since I've got these out here, when I go to the catalog, and I have to do a little bit of additional work out here for setting up my routes and kind of providing my routes out there with the shell navigation. So it knows that if I ask to go to filter, it'll pull up the filters view, basket will be basket view and stuff like that. If I use this, then use that named routing, I can get to things like, we'll just go probably, I think I had basket view before. Because it just knows that it needs to pull up that basket view. And because earlier on, all the way back, if I go to my MAUI program here, I have a little piece out here that says, where are we at here? Register view models. Yep. I've given it like these set of view models. Some of them are registered as singleton. Some of them are transient. So they get, this one's basically going to stay alive. These will stay alive for the run of the application. Right. Every time I ask for one of these ones, it's just going to make one new. And because I've registered the view with routing, and then I've told it, and I've also registered the view model with the dependency injection engine, it will automatically supply these for me. So that's where I would say the it depends comes from. Because if you use shell and you use all the shell routing, all the DI stuff works, and it works all the way down too. Because if I go into the basket view model,
right,
you'll see as well, I've got a bunch of interfaces out there, and as long as they've all been registered, they cascade down. Now, if you do the standard navigation, out of the box navigation, it doesn't exactly, we don't have that same experience. If you use like the, navigation page navigation,
Mm-hmm.
which is what a lot of applications use, honestly, at least today, we wouldn't have all of this all the way down.
And you bring up a good point, right? Like I find that the app shell in and of itself is, it's actually more cumbersome to work with in most applications that I write, because the navigation is so kind of ingrained into the logic in the business logic, right? Like, hey, when this happens, when the user clicks this button and the sky is green and the earth is blue, I need to
Sure.
be able to route to this page. When the earth is red, I got to route to this page, right? So it fundamentally changes the way a lot of, let's call them legacy Xamarin developers, know and understand in terms of the way to interact with the framework. And I find that people like that are going to probably go back more towards like a Prism or a React UI or MVVM Cross. But this shell concept is a very interesting, in my opinion, it's actually great for prototyping, but I wouldn't put it in a large scale enterprise application with like 50, 60 screens, because you're going to hit limitations.
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, this is interesting that it works out of the box with the shell navigation. So
and I do think that there's probably an opportunity somewhere, whether it goes into like something like the Maui Community Toolkit or something like that, to offer something like that for legacy code, right? Because I would like to have all of this stuff work for my old apps too, right? So if I've got something where I'm using navigation pages and I wanted to make like the easiest migration over, and I've already built out, like you're saying, I've got apps that have 200 pages on them. I might want to switch to Shell, but it might be difficult. So they're, just having that, but again, I still would like to make use of all the like cool DI stuff and everything the nice new things that we have here.
The shiny new bits.
There might be an opportunity out there. I mean, to build something out as like a shim, right? See if we can get something out there that would be a standardized way to do this, that then we could maybe use like it's something that like a reactive UI or a Prism could piggyback on, or that we could, use in that way, shape, or form. But I've had that same kind of thought, like, how do I get the nice stuff with my old apps? And so that's one of the big things after doing this with Shell. Like, it was pretty nice. If anybody who knows me, there's sometimes where I'm kind of like anti interfaces and anti dependency injection, but after doing some of this work, I was like, this actually is kind of nice. I'm maybe changing my song here a little bit, So
I might be wrong on this. So again, let me know if I am. But I feel like the concept of the shell has always been around, right? Like I feel like it was in Xamarin, but it was in like a toolkit. Like it wasn't in the box. It was like a thing you had to install, wasn't it?
It was, I'm going to forget the version of Xamarin it was introduced. I want to say it was Xamarin Forms 4 somewhere in 4. So it was kind of I would say like a late addition to Xamarin Forms.
Okay.
And so you could use it. And it was around for like 2 whole versions. So, it was around for 4. And I think it was 4, and then obviously it would be in 5.
Right.
But for some of us, like, again, for some of us old timers here that have been doing it for a long time, like we're set in our ways. We already had a lot of code that was built. So it was out there, but it was new. So I don't know what the adoption was. For new projects, like I have a couple of clients that we work with where we've used it. But those were like newer projects that started in 4 and 5. But for a lot of, there's going to be a lot of people that have existing projects, that we've got almost 10 years of Xamarin Forms now, where people are just going to have stuff where that wasn't even available when they had gotten started. So they'll still need to either choose to transition to it or figure out how they want to get that navigation moved over for the new side.
Okay. Yeah, in my experience, it's been very much like the couple of apps that I've worked with in the Xamarin 4 space that started off using App Shell. We ran into some limitations that we weren't able to do with the traditional navigation and some of the other bells and whistles that we had from the MVVM frameworks that were available. So we decided to kind of back off from that. But it seems like Shell might be something that we could revisit depending upon whether or not it can solve those concerns. So,
yeah. So I guess the thing I was trying to make sure I clarified was that, like, so Shell is optional. Like,
yes.
You don't have to use it. You can. But if you do use it, there are some opinionated constructs that you kind of have to adhere to.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah,
makes sense for you to do that.
It gives you some guide rails to work with. So it has ideas of how navigation should be done. You kind of use this like that route-based navigation. So, I think, again, for a lot of like web developers, it's probably something that's more familiar to them if they think about how like a URI gets constructed and how you kind of tack things on there. But yeah, it has a pattern that you will want to follow. Mobile gets weird sometimes. And so sometimes those patterns aren't always easy to follow on every platform, or you might have like a specific use case where, the way that this UI gets shown on iOS happens to be vastly different for how it gets shown on Android, where you might have more of a modal presentation on one platform than the other. And it can be kind of a little bit difficult to manage those types of things. But again, like depending, everything's situational. It's always an it depends type of answer. But like, Shell might be better for applications where you've got those good linear paths, if you've got those good workflows that are a little bit more straightforward. And then like, if you've got sort of a lot of edge cases, a lot of like decision, like a lot of pathing that could happen depending on like decision A or decision B, you either would have to just figure out what your route paths look like there and kind of adhere to it. Or if you know that it's kind of like, very customized, you may want to consider sticking even with just sort of the traditional navigation page approach, because then you've got the power's in your hands. But again, right or wrong, the power's in your hands. So you have to make sure that either whatever you do is consistent or whatnot out there as well. So
I look at App Shell, like what they attempted to do was give you like bumper rails for bowling, right? Like they tried to keep you in the lane and force you down the straight and narrow. Whereas the traditional Xamarin approach, you can pop the ball in the gutter and pop it back out and bust that 7-10 split, no problem.
It feels like you got cheat codes a little bit sometimes, but
well, you do, because you have access to the actual stack. And so it's funny when we talk about traditional web developers and then mobile development. I always tell people, people always say, well, mobile navigation is difficult, and I'm like, it's one of the most basic data structures we learned. It's a stack. You push something onto the stack, you pop something off of the stack. Conceptually, at that level, there's nothing hard. When you start getting into the presentation per platform, modal versus full page versus, that's when things start to get hard. How do I hide this page, navigate back so the user doesn't see it, and then man, how many times I've done that? It's like, hey, show this screen and navigate back 3 pages and then let the screen go, and the user doesn't know that they've been navigated. Like, those are the tricks you used to have to do. So sometimes your app may need that, and you may need more power, and that's where like you have the choice. I believe the current default template comes with Shell.
Shell's in there.
Yeah. And I immediately ripped that out and was like, all right, how do I get this navigation page? But there's also a new construct that I saw in MAUI, and I apologize, I know I'm going off the rails, but there's this window concept, right?
Sure.
And that's a wrapper around the page, right?
Correct. So So now you've got multiple windows. So again, kind of going back to like in forms, you have, we'll call it a window. Like, that's basically it. You're working with sort of a single presentation application. So you've got, if we think of iOS and Android, it's typically a little bit easier to think about this. It's just sort of the whole screen is your application, and that's it. But now with MAUI, we're, things are shifting a little bit. Even when we talk about the mobile side of things, like an iPad's kind of a lot of screen real estate. So now what you could do is you can sort of have 2 navigation stacks in there, if you will, or sort of 2 presentations within it. You could have multiple windows. Or if we think of going to like the desktop itself, Windows is probably the easiest way to think about this. You could have an application that has multiple windows, and they're almost like, in a way, multiple applications running out there within one application domain. So so that concept of Windows is pretty interesting and cool, I think, because now you've got sort of, like I said, sub applications. You have this one primary application runner that's out there, and you're always going to start off with a window. So you're going to start with just the one primary window and one navigation stack. But then from there, you could spawn off multiple windows, and you could change the presentation of those windows along your path. So
where it's interesting, the use case that I'm most interested in, and like I know on mobile, you have a lot of singleton services that give you information about the operating system or the environment, right? Whether or not I have network connectivity, being able to spin up a window that is basically the container for all of my services like that can then notify out to the rest of my application. To me, I saw that, I was like, oh, this is exactly what I've been wanting. I just stick all of this stuff in a window that nobody ever sees, and then I go off and I run my application the way it normally would run, and I get the information I want.
So that's one thing I've been looking at a little bit. I've been looking at it from a drawing perspective, because like that's always where I go. It's like I was immediately, what I thought is, how could I use this for cool like screen transitions? Like, could I make a new window, take a snapshot of the screen and then melt it or something, do like a Doom screen transition or something like that, or do something silly. But yeah, that's the thing. And I don't know. The window API is something I haven't fully explored outside of the drawing side, but that's sort of like my same hope as well, is how can I provide like almost like an overlay layer for my application that's situational. Maybe it's for debug purposes, maybe it's for like a toast notification or something like that. But how could we use those windows to kind of not sort of as a modal presentation, because it might be something that you could tap through. It might be something that you just kind of want to have ephemerally out there or whatnot. But I don't want to manage it as part of my navigation stack. I just sort of want to overlay it, show it, and then maybe have it disappear at a later point in time. And I think that's going to be a pretty cool feature, again, something I personally, at least I know I'm a little bit not fully up to speed on outside as just sort of the drawing side of stuff out there. So,
yeah. Does the window API have anything to do, or is it related to like foldable devices? Because you know when you have the foldables, or you may have like, I don't know, one thing over here and one thing over there. Is that like a related concept, or is that something completely different?
Well, I'm not up to speed on foldables either. Unfortunately, I haven't messed around with them too much. I know there's the flat foldable, the iPad. It gives you the ability to kind of have sort of two apps running at once, like on an iPad app, where you could have those multiple windows. And I know it would come into play on something like that. So as soon as Apple introduces a foldable iPad, I'll answer that question for you right away.
Sure.
But I probably won't get any hardware until that point in time that has that feature. So unfortunately, I don't know 100%. I think that those are kind of, I want to say that those are somewhat different, the paradigm there, but I could be wrong. I'm not 100% sure, to be honest with you.
Okay. And then the other thing I was curious about was, and this might be like a completely different project type, but then how does wearables come into this place? So I have Apple Watch or, Android Watch or whatever. Like, is this a different project, or is this another platform that I could like add thing, right? And I can target it.
At least at this point, wearables aren't part of .NET 6. So wearables have a totally different, the requirements that they have, just because you think of the form factor, in which, again, this is something that I'm sure will change over time. Every new Apple Watch that comes out gets more and more powerful and things like that. But because of some of the requirements that are in there, and honestly, I'm guessing also just the like interest in it was probably pretty low. Those types of things didn't make the cut for .NET 6 at this time. So, so if you're looking to do that, your best option is to go native, and then provide an interaction layer between that native component over to .NET 6 and MAUI.
Okay, cool. All right, so I know we have about 10 minutes left. So we saw a little bit about like what the tooling looks like, and we talked about a bunch of different APIs in our team. And I'm sure there's even more stuff there too that we can dive into. But before we go, I wanna make sure that we talk about what does or how has testing and deployment changed with .NET MAUI? Is that like a huge difference that I have to think about, or is it fairly similar to what folks are doing today?
I mean, it is different. So from a unit testing perspective, now what we could do is we could just build, the unit testing perspective, I would say, is pretty similar. This isn't too far different. I've got a project here, again, just in the eShop project. I've got my unit test project here, and you can see it's just a .NET 6 project type that we're targeting here. It's using XUnit. It does the things that you would expect it to do. At least from the unit test that I have for this is strictly testing just like the platform independent components right now. We would need like a unit test runner for the individual platforms. I know that there's some work being done there. I know there actually is a component available for us, but I know that the MAUI team's working on kind of getting that out there. I think Alan, who's part of the community, has kind of published a separate NuGet if you want to do like on platform testing for your unit tests. But like I said, for the large part, it's kind of the same way that it was before. You're going to have a lot of your same just unit tests like you would have them written in the past, I guess, for what it's worth. And then in terms of deployment, depending on how you want to do it, is a bit more simplified. I can come out here and just choose archive for publishing. I could switch it over to my release build and publish it from that way. And when I do that, I'm going to be publishing out to my different platforms. You could also do it from the command line. I think I'll probably say this wrong. I think it's MAUI deploy, MAUI command line build. I think I'm going to I know a couple people that are going to scream at me because I don't do command line stuff all the time. And this will always get me. It's either build or deploy. For doing your actual deployment on your application. But it's more simplified than anything. So you're not going to have a lot of different ins and outs with going into your iOS application, your Android application. You're going to do that deployment from a single spot for the single project from here.
Okay. So then for folks that have I don't know, maybe your DevOps pipelines or whatever it is that's set up already, it shouldn't be dramatically different. More so just thinking about, okay, well, this is a different platform. Like, how do I plug this into Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions or whatever the thing is I'm using to like roll this out?
It will be different. So I guess, yeah, from that perspective, especially when we talk about the DevOps perspective, is you're going to be switching from using sort of your traditional MS build, depending on where you're doing your pipelines and stuff like that, you would, most people, if you're using like Azure DevOps or if you're using GitHub or whatever out there, you kind of might pull in some starter code. And if you're on Azure DevOps, for example, it's got like a pre-built Xamarin Android builder or Xamarin iOS builder. And it basically underneath the sheets, it just has the command line calls it's making and it knows how to pass in all the right parameters. We're just going to be going from that to using sort of more of a .NET build going forward into the future. So there will be a modification. There are going to be changes that you're going to have to go out there for those command line tools, just because the actual command line interface has changed, right? So it's been, like I said, it's more simplified. I think it should be easier to work with in general. From what I've set up out there, it's pretty straightforward. Again, it's going to kill me. I'll think about it 5 minutes after this video of exactly what the command line is. Sure. It's either like publish or deploy. It's going to kill me, but it's a more streamlined, straightforward process. You don't have to do as much like hoop jumping, because before, like the way that you would build, and again, a lot of this is kind of masked in a pipeline if you use one of those pre-built components. But the way that you have to pass in the parameters was like, oh, if it's iOS, you kind of got to give it this, that, or the other thing. Here, It's a little bit more simplified. So you just know that you're going to go build your iOS application, build your Android application, and it's a more unified command line
experience
that you would make out there. Yep.
So it's very similar to like the .NET build experience that your web developers are used to, but now you basically send in a target framework, right? So I want to build iOS, so I send in the Net6 iOS as the target when I build and when I publish, versus the way you used to have to do it. You used to have to explicitly say, hey, MS build, go find the iOS project and build it and publish it and find the end. Like, it was very, very disconnected. It seems like it's now going to fall in line with all of the rest of the .NET stuff, which is great for us as .NET developers, because now we can switch from web to mobile to desktop, and our tooling is the exact same, which has been my biggest complaint about the whole .NET Core conversion for the past 7 years is we still can't use .NET build. We are not a first-class citizen. So here we are.
so kind of like I was saying out here, it's .NET publish, and like Rodney was just explaining as well, like it's one standardized piece that we have now, right? So I could say .NET publish. I'm going to give it the framework that I want to publish to, tell it, what kind of a build I'm doing. If I've got like release, maybe I've got a couple other bits that I need out there. And then you might have some particular parameters for the platform. So like for Android, in order to sign the application, we have to use a signing key and a key store for just, uniquely signing the key out there. And so we just pass in those parameters. But the first bit of it here is kind of all standardized, whether we were doing, iOS or Android, whatnot out there. It just changes about, the additional parameters that we might need for that platform.
Got it. And I remember in a world long, long ago, there was this thing called Xamarin Test Cloud, right? Xamarin Test Cloud had like, I don't know, you could point your app and it like multi-tested across a whole bunch of devices, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that turned into Azure App Center, if I'm not mistaken.
It became part of App Center. Yep, the testing framework.
So now my question is, like, does MAUI work with App Center? Is that like a thing that developers could look at for multi-testing their MAUI applications today, or is that not a completed story yet?
The UI testing story isn't 100% set. You couldn't use App Center for the like app testing side of it today. You could use App Center for other parts of it. Like there are libraries that they just released for doing like your error logging and some of those other bits that you might be using App Center out there for. Mm-hmm. But in terms of doing like the UI testing side of things, the existing Xamarin like UI test stuff is not going to be compatible with MAUI. So if you do have those UI tests, you may want to look into like a different testing framework, UI testing framework, or something along those lines for MAUI.
So I do know that there was some work done, and I'm about to post the link now. There's a tool called Zapium, which is supposed to be the next generation of the thing, specifically for MAUI UI testing. So I know that there was some work done there. I don't know personally. I have not used it. I'm not a UI test person. I'm more of a write some unit tests, write some integration tests, and ship the thing. But I know people that love UI tests. I do know that there was some work done. I know that this is supposed to be community driven. So, this is one of those things where if you truly need it, I would tell you to go out here, open an issue, maybe submit a pull request, don't know, and try and help out the community move this forward if this is something that you're actually planning on using. Because I believe that this is what's going to get rolled into App Center as the next Xamarin UI test cloud thing.
Got it. Okay, cool.
But don't quote me because I could be wrong.
We're going to quote you.
We're going to get Dan on our case otherwise.
I'm overdue for a call busting his chops, so it's great.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, this has been great, man. I felt like the minute MAUI came up, I had so many questions. Even as someone so I consider myself like a Xamarin hobbyist. I don't build Xamarin apps for a living or for work. But I've always found it very interesting of how that world came together. I'm particularly talking to you folks about reactive stuff over the years. I've been like, oh, this looks really interesting to me. So again, as this MAUI thing came out, I'm like, but what about this? And what about this? And what about that? And what about this? And there's just so many questions. And I know if I had a lot of questions, I'm sure a lot of folks in the community had questions.
For sure.
And even probably more than I did about well, what does the world look like going forward for the rest of us? So again, with that being said, Michael, I want to say thank you because I feel like I know much better now. I'm a little clearer about what the world looks like. And definitely would love to have you come back on again sometime soon, and we could continue this conversation and talk more about MAUI and we got to do a reactive one at some point. We haven't done any reactive stuff on the show yet, so we gotta.
Me and Rodney are ready to go right now. I mean, we're just gonna continue for another hour.
How much time you got?
3 hours. What do you got the rest of the day?
All right, then we're gonna have to get that on the calendar and figure it out. Then
for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime I can come on, help provide some feedback. If we get some questions and we want to do a Q&A session or anything like that, obviously let me know. And I guess just to kind of summarize it up too. So for anybody that is nervous or not sure about MAUI, it just think of it as sort of the next version of forms. So if you're already doing forms today, if you're already familiar with forms, you already know MAUI. So it's not like you have to relearn everything from the ground up or anything like that. You're already ready to go there.
Nice. Awesome. I'm sure that's comforting for a lot of folks, right? So there's not this, oh my gosh, I have to learn another thing. But more so, it's just I'm just upgrading the stuff that I already have versus just having to scrap what I've built over the time and making something new.
We're getting nice things, right? So
I like nice things.
We're getting that DI stuff. We're getting a nice place to register interfaces. We're getting a unified command line, way to interact with building our applications, things like that. Stuff that the community, I think, has wanted for a long time out there.
Awesome. Cool. Well, gentlemen, this has been great. And for all of you that have stayed around and hung out with us and watched this so far, definitely appreciate you being here. Again, we'll be back again. Again, we do these on Wednesdays. Feel free if you have any suggestions about more topics you want to talk about. You want us to talk more about MAUI? You want us to bring Michael on for a whole month to do a thing? I don't know. Let me know. Let us know. We can talk about it. But until then, we'll take care and we'll see you again next time. Bye, folks.